On behalf of the Library Chair, Dr. Rolene Lamb, and everyone at the library, I would like to welcome you all, and in particular, our author, Roz. Welcome, Roz.
Thank you.
Roz is no stranger to the library. After working as a TAFE College librarian, she joined the Makor Library, as we were then known, and became the library director. Roz played an integral part in the development of the Write Your Story program, which has now published over 140 memoirs and is still going strong. She has seen the library flourish over the years into not only a significant information resource, but also a community centre. We run an interesting program of events for all ages, including a weekly children's story time and a seniors club. We hold author talks, a lecture series, discussion groups, children's events, and a book club. During the lockdown, our events have moved online. And when restrictions permit, we have operated a click and collect service. We have an extensive collection of ebooks and audiobooks, which are very easy to borrow. For all our upcoming events, please visit our website, Facebook, or Instagram. In 2015, Roz published her first book, Solly's Girl. This book was written to accompany her late husband Alan's book, Alva's Boy. Roz's second book, and the topic of today's presentation, is a delightful and humorous book and is called Rosa, Memories with License. I have taken the liberty of quoting the words of a reviewer who wrote, "In this book, Collins interrogates her family's past and her late husband's story to come to a better understanding of herself and what she would like to pass on to the next generation. This book is testament to that soul searching and makes good reading for everyone interested in the lifelong business of forming identity, Jewish or otherwise." If you have any questions, please add them to the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And after Roz's talk, Naomi Recipe, one of our librarians, will pass them on to Roz. Thank you, Naomi, Hannah, and Joey from the library for contributing to today's event. Roz, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren, again for the introduction, and I'd like to thank the library board for inviting me to present an author talk. And I'd also like to thank the staff at the library who contribute so much to the richness of our communal culture. And of course, my family for their support. And I've got Daniel here with me today. The Lamb Library and I share a lot of history. Back in 1987, I shocked the treasurer at Beth Weitzman. I take the job as director of what was then the Makor Library on condition he provided me with a computer. It was the first one in the entire community centre, and it was so large it had to have its own little room. And people from all the other departments used to come in and pat it and ask to be shown how to switch it on and off. It's a long way from Zoom. An author talk is what Lauren requested, not a lecture, not a well-written opinion piece, but a talk. So what do Jews invariably talk about, if not Jewish identity? That incredible show bag of complex and often conflicting ideas. One of my non-Jewish reviewers, she commented very perceptively that Rosa was written by, and I'm quoting, an Anglo-Australian-Jewish woman for whom being Jewish, as for many, she believes, is as much, if not more, about history and heritage as God and religion. I think that's pretty accurate. So let's talk. This afternoon, I shall use my book, here she is, I hope you can see her, as a framework for examining my own identity. It's a migrant story, and hybrid publishers who have published Alan's books as well as mine, have interpreted me beautifully. They know that I wish to entertain, but we're hoping that the perceptive reader will grasp the subtext underneath, obviously, it's the subtext. I wrote it after a delightful encounter with two elderly gentlemen who, one was from Italy and one was from Greece. And they were standing in the sunshine chatting on the porch of a little house when I came by along with Roxy, my little Welsh corgi, and they called out, "Hey, you got dog like Queen." And they called out to me. So I walked her up the path so that they could pat her. And when I told them Ros, they immediately turned that into Rosa. And then they got quite flirtatious. It was lovely. They said, "You pretty." Then when I left, they called out, "Ciao, Bella Rosa, you come again and see us." It did wonders for my self-esteem. I was on my way to visit a doctor, and he's from Georgia in the Caucasus. And our meetings always began with a discussion of Dostoevsky and Shakespeare, which he's reading to improve his English. And so there we were, and I reflected upon this when I got home. An Italian, a Greek, a Russian, and a 10-pound pom. It sounds like the start of a joke. And now all of us are Australians, but the pom also has a Jewish identity. On my 8th birthday in 1938, my parents gave me a copy of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. It's one of my favorite books. Although she's Victorian and I was a child of the Great Depression, I've always identified with Alice, who was the same age as me. She's a very polite little girl, often pedantic and frequently confused about her identity and the society in which she lives. She tells the caterpillar, "I can't explain myself because I'm not myself." You see? And even at that young age, I sympathized with her. We lived in Ilford, an outer suburb of London, about 6 miles beyond the fringes of the Jewish East End, where my parents had spent their childhood. In Melbourne terms, it was rather like growing up in Nunawading instead of Carlton. I was an only child and an only grandchild to my widowed grandmother, Regina, every Saturday for Shabbos lunch. The sewing machines in the upstairs workshop would be silent for the Sabbath. My father's 5 unmarried sisters would be free to make a fuss of me. And for many years, until my cousin Gina was born, it seemed that I might be the only descendant to continue that family line. I've reconstructed the romance of Regina and Morris Gilbert. He came from Lemberg, now Lviv, and she from Blitz, Biala, that's all part of Galicia. He was a master tailor in the Austro-Hungarian army and was stationed with the emperor's cavalry, for whom he made those elaborate Merry Widow kind of uniforms, all brass buttons and gold braid, and they still fought duels then. Anyway, without permission, he left the army and took Regina and their growing family across Europe to settle in London. Morris found a job with an upmarket men's outfitters that made robes for Christian clergymen. And it was one of those very, very posh English companies with a name something like Smith, Brown, Robinson, Fox and Company Limited. And the orders came mostly by mail, and the services of Mr. Fox, master tailor, were often requested. Trouble was Mr. Fox had died. So my enterprising grandfather said, "Well, that's okay, I'll be Mr. Fox." But he never officially became naturalized or changed the family's name. So some of us are Gilbert, and some, including me, ended up as Fox. Morris and Regina had 5 daughters and just one son, my father, Solly, who, like Asher Lev in the novel, wanted to study art, but instead he had to become his father's apprentice. But he found many outlets for his creativity. And perhaps as a nod to the king, miniature military style coats for me, complete with the shiny buttons and the braid, but no sword. Sadie's parents came from the Russian Empire, My grandfather Nathan was, I believe, probably conscripted as a child into the army of Tsar Alexander III, and he fought in the war against the Turks. I have a Russian language leave pass that allowed him to travel through the Pale of Settlement, and severe penalties were threatened unless he returned to the barracks in Kiev within 3 months. Otherwise, it was... So he didn't go back. He just kept going until he reached the coast and caught a boat to London, to England. And at the port of London, probably a sweatshop owner would pick him up and put the migrants to work in slave-like conditions. And Nathan ended up making men's caps. He had a piece of paper with just one address in London, a family who came from the same town in Russia. So he became their lodger, and he married the eldest daughter, my grandmother, Eva. And they set up home in Rothschild's buildings, which is a huge tenement block close by the area where just a few years earlier, Jack the Ripper had terrorized the community. Nathan's surname, Chwal, which he spelt Chwall, it was impossible for the English authorities, and so we became the Samuel family. He never learned to speak English, so when he visited us, I was unable to have a conversation. He called me a Shana Madel, a pretty girl, and this is the title of chapter 5 where I've written about him. Back in Ilford, there was just a handful of Jewish founding members of the first tiny local synagogue. My family was mainstream Orthodox. They weren't specifically very, very Orthodox, just mainstream. And my mother kept a strictly kosher kitchen. She would sometimes take me on a number 25 red bus to Whitechapel and to Petticoat Lane, and she'd buy herring and cream cheese. For lunch, we would go to the butcher's in Red Lion Yard and buy hot salt beef sandwiches with pickled cucumber. Back in Ilford, I would have shepherd's pie or Cornish pasties for my midday school hot dinner, followed by apple crumble and custard. My mother would have been horrified. And at morning assemblies, I would sing Onward Christian Soldiers with great enthusiasm. On Sundays, Solly sent me to Cheder, Sunday school classes at the synagogue. I was totally confused, and my East End grandmother was worried, with every justification, that I knew nothing of Yiddishkeit, Jewish culture. I have a school report on which the headmaster has written, "A nice girl, but worries too much." How very true, and how like Alice. By my late teens, I'd more or less decided that I would adopt a British rather than Jewish identity. I think I'll say that again because it is a bit important. I would be British rather than Jewish. And my cousins, the children of my mother's brothers and sisters, they were all involved in Jewish communal life, which I considered dull and conservative and very narrow. So in my early 20s, I left home unwed, which was a bit unusual, to live in Hampstead, which at the time seemed a very bohemian move. I returned to Ilford, but I had no answer to the perennial question, "No, so when are you going to get married?" Now, Alan, I think we better get a picture of him up there. Here he is. I don't know if you can see that. Yep, okay. Alan, a penniless Australian Jew with no family to speak of, very limited prospects, no what is called in Yiddish yichus status, and a Lambretta motor scooter was the perfect answer. It was absolutely perfect. We shared an attic room in an old Edwardian house full of colourful characters, and I've written about them. And when it was time for him to return to his job in Melbourne, I was more than happy to come too, although I did have the decency to suggest we get married first and not shame my parents too much. Actually, Sadie and Solly were quite remarkable, and they never questioned my choice. With hardly a backward glance, I became a 10-pound pom and escaped to Melbourne. In chapter 1, it's called Going to Austria. It illustrates how very little I or my family knew of Australia. As the Stratheden steamed up Port Phillip Bay in April 1957, Al belatedly offered a few pointers to Australian life. See there, that's Luna Park Fun Fair, and that's the Palais Theatre. You'll love it, Rosa. St Kilda's by the beach. We can go swimming, and we can go on picnics, take the Lambretta to visit the Dandenongs. And Rosa assumed that the Dandenongs were Mr. and Mrs. and another one of these weird Australian names, and it didn't sound like a Jewish family at all. Al hadn't mentioned mountains, so how was she to know? And this is on the cover of Rosa, and it's really rather pertinent here. And so, blazing heat of that first summer, she thought of London at Christmas time, with chestnuts roasting in the streets, mandarins in silver paper at the greengrocers. And she rode on the back of the Lambretta through the beachside suburbs, through Chelsea, Sandringham, and Brighton, and she wept at the familiar names in the unfamiliar land. And that's on the front of the book. My ancestors had arrived in London in the late 1800s, but Alan's forebears, including Al Convict, had settled in New South Wales and Queensland, or as early as 1830. We were, without a doubt, very Anglo. And I must have a little drink, and you can admire my Jubilee mug. Alan was emphatically Anglo-Australian, complete with a vocabulary of 1930s slang and the make, do and mend inventiveness of a regular Aussie. His reprobate father, we called him Marrying Sam because he had 4 wives, his reprobate father, a misanthropic xenophobe, who is wonderfully described in Alan's short story, 1,000 Nights at the Ritz, lived in a room above a pub in Bondi Road, Sydney. And that was all the family we had. So we were a very nuclear family, just Alan, me, and 3 little boys, and a Welsh corgi. But Australian Jewish society had been transformed by the post-war influx of Eastern European migrants. Our friends all had families that came from somewhere else. Alan's book, Alva's Boy, will be remembered as a classic of Australian literature. It's one of the very few memoirs to describe from a completely Australian point of view the intersection of 2 Jewish cultures, the Anglos like us and the refos, the refugees from Europe. My career chronology is in chapter 9 of Rosa. It's called Carrying the Banner. I'll tell you why in a minute. In London, it began in the local municipal library and then came a stint in Fleet Street at a national newspaper, followed by 4 years in advertising agencies. At the time of my marriage, I was a trainee buyer of see-through nylon night dresses at Marks and Spencer. I brought a tea chest of samples with me to Australia, which I guess added a certain flavour to our relationship. In Melbourne, I spent 20 years with the education department, finally becoming a TAFE college librarian. The chapter title, Carrying the Banner, refers to my proud membership of the Technical Teachers Union of Victoria. Then came 13 years at Macaw Library, at the end of which I was presented with a beautiful silver challah plate inscribed, among other words, wonderful dedication, vision, and tenacity, which is really just a very polite way of acknowledging that I fought very passionately for the library, drove everybody mad, and made one accountant so angry that he banged the glass top of his desk and broke it. I retired from Macquarie and was contemplating a return to study. Typically, I was planning an MA on the English Victorian novelist. Rachel Kalman, Vice President of the Kadima, was on the phone pretty quickly, insisting that as I now had absolutely nothing to do, I should catalogue the extensive collection. The following 12 years, I worked from home, visiting the Kadima once a week to pick up box after box of literary history. Often the books were elaborately bound in leather with gold leaf ornament, but sometimes they were no more than just crumbling, faded sheets held together with rusty staples. And I'd show Alan the books, and I'd show him grainy pictures of long dead authors who had written accounts of the destruction of their village in the Holocaust. And this is a little quote from the book. Rosa is weeping. I couldn't even find the village in the atlas. It's been erased by some thoughtless publisher. It's Yiddish. Only a few people will ever find out what happened. There's just my catalogue entry to provide a link. And she's really upset. And Alan says, that's important. He tells her, libraries are important. This is your contribution. Well, working within the Jewish community at Macquarie after years in the education department was a real cultural shock, but it was nonetheless a computerized library operating in English. However, Kadima, well, that was something completely different. I worked with volunteers who had all been born in Europe, and in the summer, when we wore short sleeves, I could see the numbers tattooed on their arms. And they could all say words like Czestochowa, even if they stumbled over Wimbledon and Westminster. And I couldn't speak more than a few words of either Yiddish or Hebrew. I was embarking on what we now call a learning curve. Bono Wiener, a name that might be familiar to some of you, was a towering, controversial figure of Melbourne's socialist Bundist culture. And he'd also been in Auschwitz. We only ever it was enough. Bono was tall, and I'm short. I'm rather polite and very British. He pretended to be irascible, but his eyes twinkled. He came across me in the dusty shelves at Kadima and demanded, "Who are you? What's your name? Where are you from?" And when I said I was from London, Bono became very impatient. No. I mean, where does your family come from? And with one sentence, he dismissed my allegiances to Jane Austen, Winston Churchill, Trafalgar Square, and the Beatles. No more ruled Britannia, face to face with my Jewish identity and all that implied. But it's so much more complicated than that. I found that it was only possible for me to write about the Holocaust and World War II in very small pictures, drawing on short, intimate snatches of memory. And I just hope that my readers discover the subtext. Chapter 10 is called Rosa's Wars, and some of these little bits are from that. I was 9 when my grandmother's sister Bertha, her husband Adolf, very unfortunate name, and their children escaped Austria and arrived in London. They were the only survivors of the Schlesinger family, and they were very sophisticated Viennese. And although the sisters were overjoyed to see each other, Bertha's family had very little in common with my lower class East End relatives. They soon took off for a more cosmopolitan area of London. But the afternoon of their arrival was quite memorable. My grandmother stood me on a chair, all dressed up with a satin bow on my golden hair, and Uncle Adolf, who was in the film business, agreed that I was destined to be the next Shirley Temple. Then she manicure set, I'm not sure if that's Art Nouveau or Art Oh, I'm not sure. Set in a beautiful little round pigskin case lined with red velvet, very Viennese, and it came with me to Melbourne. I was about 10 when our next door neighbour, Tom, who had served in the Indian Army, came over to our house and told my parents he'd read something about Jews and concentration camps. He assured us if the Germans invaded, as everyone feared they would, he would shoot us rather than allow us to be taken away. Now, Tom was my very best friend, and so it seemed incomprehensible to me. I was about 11 when Churchill's wife, Clementine, broadcast an appeal for us to do all we could to support our brave Russian allies who had now changed sides. My friends and I very patriotically went door to door selling little brooches we'd made out of darning wool to raise money. Of course, I slept in shelters and was evacuated with my gas mask, and I experienced the Blitz, and so did many, many others. When the Age newspaper interviewed me back in April this year, I could truthfully say that I was never frightened, even when the bombs were falling and Solly took me out into the street to see the red glow in the sky as London burned. One of my grandsons recently told me that he thought I was brave, but that's nonsense. I understood that Britain stood alone and that Churchill offered us blood, sweat and tears and expected us to fight on the beaches. But I also knew that all of us were united in a common cause. No question of having a protest march in those days. More to the point, I suppose, is that I felt that the threat was to me as an English girl rather than a specifically Jewish one. I was 15 when I, for the record. In Melbourne in 1965, our family grew by one. Our foster son, I've called him the boy, is the subject of chapter 8. He's the child of Holocaust survivors. Jewish welfare asked us, I'd never heard of them, by the way, when they rang me, they asked us to look after him for 3 months. And at the end of that time, we just sat around the table and asked him if he wished to go or stay. I'd like to stay, he said. And he did. Al and I, back in our Hampstead attic, we discussed the idea, it's a sort of fantasy, of 4 children and a dog in suburban Melbourne. And now, quite seamlessly, the boy completed the picture. And he's a grandfather now, and a talented artist. And we spend hours reminiscing over cheesecake. In 1972, we took our young sons to Europe. In Munich, they wanted to see the soccer stadium, and they were very upset when they were told they were going to visit a concentration camp, Dachau. However, I don't think they have ever forgotten Alan telling the bus driver that he wanted 5 tickets to Dachau and adding in a very loud voice, return. We also took them to Israel, to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, and some of us have been back again. I made a number of overseas visits during my working life. A travel agent suggested a stopover in Amsterdam, and in the book, this is quite true, I didn't make this up. Rosa visits the Anne Frank house. She's moved by the picture postcards on the wall above Anne's bed. Film stars and members of the European royal families, including one of the English princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, 2 little girls in pretty summer dresses. Anne Frank, Margaret Windsor and Rosa were of the war. Anne, of course, was sent to Westerbork and Auschwitz, died in Bergen-Belsen in 1945. Margaret lived a notorious life full of scandal and died a sad figure in 2002, having ruined her health with smoking. Rosa, the Anglo-Australian 10-pound pom, sits by an Amsterdam canal and concludes that she's been very, very fortunate indeed. Where is your family from? Bono had demanded. And in researching for my book, I learned a little more. There were 4 great uncles, my grandmother's brothers, who died in Auschwitz. There was my great aunt, grandfather Nathan's sister, whose letters from Kiev abruptly stopped coming in 1941. Did she die in the massacre at the ravine near Babi Yar? I don't know. Probably. Even though I write in my introduction that I'm not taking readers far into Eastern Europe, it gets closer in chapter 14 called Travelogue. We visited Prague, lovely city, but Eastern Europe holds no nostalgic memories and I would never go there. Which brings Rosa and me, both of us, back to Jewish identity and where in the world I belong. In the 1970s, a letter from Israel invited us to emigrate, to live on a rural moshav, a community with like-minded people, by which they probably meant English-speaking migrants. Surprisingly, I would have gone, but for Alan, Australia meant too much. I've been to Israel several times, and although I don't speak Hebrew and I'm critical of Israeli politics, there is a sense of homecoming that is absolutely undeniable. So let me finish this talk with chapter 11. Rosa is in Israel for an international Jewish library conference and is staying in a large hotel. Who is this waltzing Matilda? Says the hotel concierge to his assistant, reading Rosa's fax to Al and the incomprehensible reply that has just come through from Melbourne. Darling, I'm the only Australian at the conference and they expect me to sing Morsi Matilda at the closing function. It's a big dinner on Sunday. I don't know the words. Please send. Maybe it's a code or even something to do with espionage, like Matahari. You reckon it's a Mossad issue? The concierge had been in the Irgun underground and was a very suspicious type. No, I think it's a song the Australians sing sometimes at sporting events, something to do with a man and his sheep called Matilda. You are joking. I thought only Southern European shepherds carried on like that. Yeah, but Australia's a big country. Perhaps it gets lonely out there on the prairie. Prairie? That's America. Anyway, if you think it's good to go, ask one of the waiters to slip it under the door of room number 613. And I've kept the faded fax with the words I sang at that conference all those years ago in Jerusalem. The mostly American audience cheered and clapped, and I did my very best to clarify the inexplicable relationship between the jolly swagman, the billabong, Matilda, and me. Thank you.
And now it's time for questions from all of you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Good. We'll see what we could get through in the time remaining. Ros, this is from Ian. Were you aware of much inequality for women during your career?
Oh, yes. It was all very, very different. When I worked in my first job at the municipal library, there was very strict censorship. You weren't allowed to go into the senior library until you were about 14 years of age. And when I worked in the senior part of the library, the censorship was very strict. Lady Chatterley was under the counter, and so was the Kinsey report on human sexuality. And then when I went to work in advertising agencies, I really came up against it. I was not nominated by my boss for a senior position, but we dealt with advertising accounts, they're called, and the chairman of the board, this was one of the biggest advertising agencies in the world, I might say, and the chairman said, no, we can't promote her. We only have women executives for 2 accounts. One is Tampax and the other one is Peyton and Baldwin's knitting wool. So there was no future for me there, and so I went off to Marks and Spencer's, where there was no inequality whatsoever. Women were treated equally there. And then when I came to work in the education department, well, that was another thing altogether. You weren't allowed to wear slacks pants for work, and married women were pretty well frowned upon, and you were relegated to a superannuation scheme that wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And really the union fought very hard for us to have equality, financial equality. So yeah, I certainly did experience that, absolutely. But it was an interesting, because you know, it was the start of that wave of Jewish liberation, or women's liberation, if you like, and so that happened all around me. Although I didn't actually belong to any particular organisation, and I really didn't need to, because I wasn't downtrodden at all. And you know, Alan worked from home, and he did all the cooking and all the shopping, and I went off to work at the college.
Thanks, Ros. We have one from Fran. You were on the front page of The Age this year in an article about survivors of World War II. How would you compare then and now?
I wasn't frightened. We didn't. Well, I don't think my parents' generation, we were very stoic, and for me it was just normal. I didn't sort of worry very much about bombs and things like that. It was just every day. I think today's teenagers, and I was a teenager then, I think nobody worried about the state of our mental health then, and I think I think we just accepted that this was how it was. I remember being out on the street one day during an air raid, and I shouldn't have been, and there was a dog fight going on, you know, up above, and there was, you know, 30 centimetres long. It fell on the pavement just behind me, and I turned around and I picked it up, and it was hot and all jagged, and if it had hit me on the head, I would have been dead, I suppose. And I took it home, and when my mother opened the door, that's the first time, only time in my life I've ever been smacked. She took one look at it and she just smacked me because she was frightened. But otherwise, yeah, it was just life as normal. It wasn't anything like those stories that we've all read of children, you know, in underground tunnels in the sewers of Warsaw, or surviving in a concentration camp. It was a very different sort of scene, and I can truly say I was not frightened. That was life.
Now, from Judy, you mentioned your foster son. How did it affect the family dynamics? Your other boys were still quite small, weren't they?
Yes, Toby was 3, Peter was 5, and Daniel was about 6 or 7. And suddenly we had a teenager. And but more than that, the boys actually acquired another father figure, because Alan and I were we were kind of wishy-washy liberals, if you like. Every time if the kids experienced anti-Semitism, which they did occasionally, they went to Mount Scopus and they came on public transport. And sometimes at the bus stop, other kids would say nasty things to them, and they came home and they complain about it. And Alan and I would say, just take no notice, just take no notice. but he wouldn't have anything like that. He said, I'll go and solve. I mean, and then they got their cultural education from him rather than from us. I mean, we might have been wanting to play certain kind of music, or, you know, on records or so on, but they learned all about the Beatles and Creedence Clearwater Revival, and they learned about motorbikes, and so they had a dual father figure there. It was an amazing experience for them, and for Alan and me too. It was wonderful. It was great. It was absolutely great. Yeah.
And I think this is probably the last question we'll have time for today. Are you writing something new?
Oh yes. Well, I'm finished with Rosa, or me. I want to go back to the 1800s, and I want to use characters based on Alan's ancestry. There's our convict, of course. Did I ever tell you what he was transported for? No, I didn't. He was transported for his part in a most unusual robbery. He was part of a gang who stole the silverware from Duke's Place Synagogue in London, and that is a most unusual crime. I mean, he wasn't a pickpocket or anything like that. This is really an unusual situation. And he came here, and he ended up making good in Goulburn. He's one character, and then there were two brothers that came later. They were free settlers. One went to Queensland, and one went to Sydney, and the Sydney one became Alan's great-grandfather. And then there is my late father-in-law. We called him Marrying Sam. I think I said that before. And I've got lots and lots of information from the National Library in Canberra. You can look up all the old newspapers, and it's lovely to look. And Sam, who had the 4 wives, the first one ended in divorce, and the Sydney Morning Herald reporter reported it very salaciously. He said, in the magistrate's court, they said that the aggrieved wife, she had found postcards in her husband's pocket, and one can only imagine what the postcards were like. I've no idea. but yeah, so I'm writing about them because I really want to say something about the Anglo-Australian experience that is not I didn't want it to be academic. I wanted to fictionalize and dramatize it, and so it's not a serious history. It'll be like Rosa when I do it.
Thanks, Ros.
Okay.
We would like to thank you all for attending today's event with Ros Collins. Ros, it has been so interesting to hear stories from your life. You've certainly entertained us. Ros's book can be purchased at all good bookstores. And of course, we also do have a copy in the library for borrowing. Our next event is on October the 14th. Ted Latkin will be interviewed by Andrew Hasties. And on the 28th of October, we'll be welcoming Diane Armstrong, author of The Collaborator, who will be interviewed by Francis Prince. See you at the next event.